Coming up with the Eastern and Western Conference Finals now set, we look at how it reflects on the Brooklyn Nets, their timeline for success, and whether or not they're picking just the absolute worst point to go ahead into a rebuild. We dive in, coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And Doug, we're talking Eastern and Western Conference Finals, and obviously, how it relates back to Brooklyn and just getting in the mix here for the NBA playoffs.
It's been really instructive, I think. I mean, jokes aside, I think it's been really instructive to think about how this NBA landscape is going to unfold here over the next couple of years. Some things you can take away that might work in the Nets' favor. A lot of things that might really not work in the Nets' favor at all, just in terms of the timelines around some of these teams and sort of the teams that have now made it all the way following, I mean, I would call it like legendary Timberwolves Nuggets game on Sunday evening. That was just an all-timer. I mean, really actually will probably only not be an all-timer only because it wasn't far enough along in the playoffs. Everything else about it was amazing. Like, it kind of now depends on where Minnesota lands, but in terms of like what it represented, anyway, we can get into that more, but like really was as great a game as you could ever kind of get in terms of just like sort of leverage.
Those series sometimes, I mean, we'll see how the Western Conference plays out. It's going to be Timberwolves and Mavericks over there. But those series sometimes, to your point, when they end, you go, boy, I hope the Western Conference Finals lives up to it, right? Because now you had that such a great seven game battle in that series. You wanted to carry over, and it's going to be almost impossible to match that level of intensity, especially because you have the defending champs and the Nuggets there. And ironically enough, I didn't realize it until yesterday when they lost. It's now, 5-6 seasons in a row that the defending champions do not make it back to the conference finals, the second round, the following year, right? So, I mean, even that alone is high-level instructive about how hard it is to not only achieve the ultimate goal, winning a championship, but then also be at the high level in the mix year over year in either conference.
Yeah, and so like that's the part where you take away like the part for the Nets is you say to yourself, okay, well, it's hard to sustain being great over long periods of time so that it's going to be available for other teams on a year-by-year basis. I mean, if you're a Nets fan, that's sort of what you kind of you prop this whole thing up on, right? It's like, hey, it's hard to get back, it's hard to repeat, it's hard to just go far in the playoffs year after year. Injuries, timelines, player movement, like this stuff does change sometimes really quickly.
Yeah.
And that honestly, like that's the thing the Nets are probably banking on the most is that upheaval works in their favor at this point. Because like obviously like, you know, slow long-term build doesn't work in their favor because they're not doing that. But in terms of just in terms of like, hey, the landscape's going to change and maybe we'll benefit. I mean, that's kind of what they're kind of banking on. To some degree, it's probably correct. It's a little harder to see because of some of these teams that are actually really good now.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into that. Like the teams that are really good that are in the Western and Eastern Conference Finals for the most part have one thing going for them, which is they're super young and they have superstars. They have superstars that are on the younger side. That is a little hard when you start looking at, you know, how this could play out for the team. But yeah, like they are probably banking on sort of like the entropy of the landscape, right? It's just going to get chaotic, and that's probably what they're hoping for.
And even I'll stay Western Conference centric just for a minute because we'll talk Eastern and the Pacers we want to get into, even the Knicks who get eliminated obviously in the Game 7, corpses all over the court for them as they try to make their way through the playoffs. But out West, when you look at it, just to your point, there's a couple of things that like not even for the Nets, but Nets and the NBA overall. The fact that the Mavericks are in the Western Conference Finals, there was a version of it where people speculate, hey, if it doesn't work out with Kyrie, what will their next move be, right? Will they potentially make a pivot and try to rebuild in a different way around Luka? Now, instead, you look at a team, no matter what the result is, they're going to try to run that thing back next year. You know, the Timberwolves are going to be in there. The Clippers look like they're in locked-in mode just because they're going to a new arena, all these things. So there's actually a lot of ways that this is played out in the West specifically, where it's like, yeah, nothing's going anywhere in terms of teams that maybe would decide, hey, we're going to pivot out of this. The OKC gets eliminated, but they're a really young, good team, so they may only look to add to it. So sometimes you get results in the playoffs that inspire teams to say, all right, let's go ahead and start our retool, our rebuild a year early. For the most part, it's all been, no, we're going to probably double down no matter what the result is. And that's another bad sign for any team in the Nets position trying to rebuild and get things back on track.
Yeah, because right. When you look at these teams, it's sort of how they're already built. Now, look, you want to say too, like a lot of what we're going to talk about is in the Western Conference, and the Eastern Conference is much more of a crapshoot at this point. I can definitely hear that part because like we are focused on the Western Conference here, where we're like, okay, well, Luka, he's 25. You have SGA. You have obviously Ant, who's now in the Western Conference Finals. You have all these guys. You have Jokic, who ran out of gas there at the end, but it's hard to see him having just like a massive drop off here in the next few years. And so you look at these teams. Now you're saying, okay, well, great, good news. They're on the Western Conference. Now we look over to the Dust Bowl Eastern Conference that can't get a single team healthy all the way through. And all of a sudden you start telling yourself a totally different story.
Right.
And maybe that's the case. And maybe that is like the thing that they look at the most, because, if we highlight who got through, it was kind of just like the team that lost the least amount of guys, plus Boston, who had the ability to lose a guy and still kind of be okay because everyone else lost guys.
Right.
Right. Now you would also say, well, is that going to happen every single year? You probably can't bank on that either. And so it's a tough spot. I mean, they're in a really, really tough spot when you kind of look at the landscape.
So Western Conference tells us Brooklyn Nets winning a championship in the near future, maybe not likely. But as Doug started to allude to, Eastern Conference making the playoffs, being kind of fun. We'll go ahead, or at least I will, give you the silver lining version using Indiana Pacers as the prime example. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Yahoo Finance. Look, we live in a really changing environment when it comes to finance, when it comes to keeping all of your stuff in one place. We got inflation, we got portfolio management. It can be tough. Like you're looking at your debt, you're looking at your mortgage, you're looking at all your investments, where they all can be in one place. This is where Yahoo Finance has it figured out. You can get access to news, data, tools, all you need in order to reach that financial freedom you're looking for. Make sure you put all of your investments into one place where you can see them all in a really, really easy view, see how they're performing, hopefully on their way up. Yahoo Finance wants to be your one and is your one-stop shop for everything you need in the terms of financial world. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Maybe you're a seasoned investor. Maybe you're just looking for extra guidance. Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place with a community over 90 million users each month. Their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. The number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. And we're done with that. Head on over to our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks Fantasy made so easy. That's because Prize Picks figured this out. You don't want to wrestle with salaries. You don't want to go against sharks in the water. You want to go against the Prize Picks projections. You want to go more or less on those numbers. Go up to 10 times, or excuse me, 100 times. I went low, 100 times your money on Prize Picks with just as few as 4 picks. All you're doing, like I said, with let's say NBA, you're going more or less in points, rebounds, blocks, assists, steals, MLB, homers, strikeouts, all the stuff that you've gotten used to as a sports fan. You put those together, you can win up at the 100x. Turn out $10 into $1,000 with basketball, hockey. You got the college sports as well. It's all there for you over on Prize Picks right now. Download the app and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for first deposit match up to $100. Download the Prize Picks app. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA. First deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
All right, so as we continue the Locked On Nets episode, reminder, get us over at Doug Norrie and at Adam Armbrecht on X, where we're just popping off with all kinds of insights around the NBA playoffs and, of course, the Brooklyn Nets. Now, we said at the top, talking about the landscape and how it impacts the Brooklyn Nets. Western Conference is a beast. That's just the reality of it. And if you're one of those teams, if you're the Lakers right now, have fun. You figure out what you want to do this offseason because it's going to be a mess to keep yourself competitive. In the East, however, understanding that the New York Knicks, it was the walking wounded, it was the last man standing, it was Jalen Brunson, broken hand, everything. So we understand if you are a Knicks fan, we're not the Nets centric that throws slight at them. It stinks. You were a really good team, and any other year with the average number of injuries that come over the course of a season and playoffs, you're likely in the Eastern Conference Finals right now. But you get absolutely decimated and you don't make it. So the Pacers advance. And this was thrown up, by the way, on the classic whatever outlets. Who do you want to see win the championship? I said Haliburton and the Pacers, just because it would be the absolute last thing anybody is anticipating or desires. And you'd be like, yeah, great. He wins one before Luka. I think that's the best narrative that you could put forth. How much are you willing to say that the Pacers are a good example of why the Brooklyn Nets can at least be competitive in a fairly short order? Remember, these two teams were within 1 win projection of over-unders coming into the year. Now, whether or not the Pacers are always going to be likely to make it out of this type of run in the playoffs and go to the Eastern Conference Finals, fine, debatable, less than 1%, great. But they're in the playoffs, and they won a series, and then they maybe got lucky with injuries and got to win another one. The Nets can't do that because they weren't in the playoffs. That's how close you can be, though, to maybe going on a little run.
Yeah, sure. I mean, making the playoffs is step one, right? Like making the playoffs and have everything break right for you is the first step. It's hard for Nets fans to see this because they've had like make the playoffs, everything break wrong for so many years in a row that it's hard to think that like, oh, maybe one day things will kind of just break out in front of us correctly. It's like,
right, when
well,
we had all the superstars, things broke absolutely horrifically. Now, without the superstars, be optimistic. They can
what an understatement. I mean, that's an understatement of the century to say they broke horrifically. It was like literally the worst possible outcome. I really can't imagine, short of just like World War III or something breaking out where basketball doesn't matter anymore. After, then number two, the way the Nets way, not overstating that, by the way. Yeah. No, but in terms of that, it's hard to see. But like if you look at how the playoffs have shaken out in the Eastern Conference, right, you can tell yourself a story where it's like, okay, we exceed expectations. Everyone kind of gets a little better or is a little better than we thought, right? Like Haliburton, I think most people thought that he was kind of on this path and he takes a little leap, and then and even he probably didn't take like the massive leap I think most people thought it was going to happen. I think there's probably some injury and stuff in there, but then they make a trade for Siakam to sort of marginally or get better around not even the margins, just add this other top 50-ish player, top, wherever you want to land with him. And then all of a sudden you're just a good, decent team, right? Yeah. And then things work out well. And, I don't know if they should tell themselves a story that, okay, now we're one more move from a championship. They're probably not. But sometimes in the NBA, the goal is to kind of just, exceed expectations. They've clearly done that. And if that's where you are with the Nets timeline and build, can we see a situation where the Nets make a move and then everyone kind of just like stays healthy and they play and the new coach kind of puts them together? I think that's a fine story to tell. And I think that's what you kind of need to be banking on at this point. Again, with the Nets, it's so hard to see because they've legit been like the nut low on outcome for so long right now. But you're right. You're right. I think you do a good job of bringing that in as a possibility for the Nets. Mostly because I think you'll never hear that from anybody else because it's so hard to see. But I think I think that's a good job by you to bring it in, and especially to compare those over-unders in the season, because I think that when you posted that the other day, I was like, oh, that's really good. That's an interesting comparison about where these things can go.
And again, it's like to what you say, remember, the Nets are maybe one of the only teams based on over-under projections that grossly missed the mark on this. By the way, I think it was Orlando was 35.5 coming into the season. So talk about overachievers as well. And it's even beyond, it's not about beating the Knicks and making it to the Eastern Conference Finals. Remember, the Pacers won a first-round series. So there's multiple versions of this. Nets make the playoffs, win a first-round matchup maybe because it breaks well. The Knicks kind of got, I don't want to say lucky because of the injury, so you can't use that word with them and their postseason. But they got a nice break getting up to the second seed, earning the second seed, and then having things happen near the bottom of the bracket where it was like, okay, we get Philadelphia and they're not 100% healthy. Now we catch the Pacers, a team that we don't think is top tier. Unfortunately, injuries derail us as well. The other part about it too.
Can I cut you off for 1 second? Because I want to say one more thing about the Knicks. The other thing about the Knicks is, and this is where like you say to yourself, okay, can the Nets end up being something like this? you look at the Knicks and you're like, where they track along with the Pacers is that they had guys who kind of got a lot better quicker than you thought they were going to be, right? Like Haliburton, they trade for Haliburton for Sabonis. And it's like, okay, well, I think most people thought even in the moment that was a great win for the Pacers, but then Haliburton did just get like better, right? Yeah. And then you look over at the Knicks, you're like, they signed Brunson. I think people were like, that's a pretty good signing. No one ever thought it was this good, where he just can carry a team on his back. So you're like, all right, can like a guy like Cam Thomas just get better? I'm sure, right? Like, and can he get to that level? I don't know, but it's easy to forget sometimes that these other guys weren't at these levels until they were. Yeah. Right. And then they are, and then you kind of can't remember that they weren't. But if you're just trying to tell yourself sort of a story, then maybe you're like, okay, well, they have guys that take leaps, right? Like maybe Cam Thomas takes a leap into that next level of guy. I only say that because we've seen it from other guys. So anyway, sorry to cut you off, but like the Knicks kind of do follow that same path.
No, but that's exactly a part of it too, right? Like again, it is hard to see the Nets having these either lucky breaks or having things work their way. But Cam Thomas all of a sudden enters the conversation of being a top X player. You see some of the consistency. They make a little margin move here in the offseason, and you just see a team that goes from, I don't know, let's say they're right on the same thing, right? 38.5 kind of wins next year. Well, all of a sudden they become 42 wins. That's not a seismic leap, but it's enough to say you're in the playoffs now. And now maybe the first round matchup works out because team X or Y got into a certain seeding and you catch a bit of a break there. This isn't painting the picture of, and that's how the Brooklyn Nets give away no assets, don't need to bring in a star and end up in the finals. No, that's not what it is, but getting yourself back on a solid footing and feeling like you can have success. And oh, by the way, just before we go a layer deeper specifically on the Nets, for the Indiana Pacers, when you go and think about it from this perspective, because we're talking about this offseason, Donovan Mitchell, really big assets to go get him, go get a star, whatever the case may be. We highlighted, well, would Darius Garland maybe be a pivot option for the Brooklyn Nets? Remember, the Raptors ended up with Brown, Lewis, Nwora, 2 first-round picks via the Pacers in 2024. I'll do the classic thing where I've been saying, listen, yes, it's no, bad draft class, but there's still good players in it. Okay, but if it's one of the weaker ones, you gave away 2 first-round picks, you feel better about that, and a conditional first-round pick in 2026. They got back Siakam for that in a future second. My point being is that price tag for a guy that was going to the final year of a contract, everyone anticipates the Pacers are going to bring Siakam back. That's not that bad. Like, that's not a huge price point to move the needle. So can Brooklyn be in a position next year where Cam Thomas starts to show that next level of his game, where you feel optimistic enough, Clowney and others, maybe Mikal Bridges just playing to par here, and you go, okay, who's the guy on an expiring deal that doesn't take a lot? He's not at the elite of the elites, but we bring him in and we cement our playoff positioning for next season. That can matter. That can move the needle for the organization in the short term.
Oh, yeah. I mean, totally agree. And I think that's probably where they have to be thinking about themselves. If they're not going to blow it up, which is really, they're not going to do, it doesn't seem like at this point, then, or hold on one second, because we'll make one more
what it is. Let me say, here is the problem coming up here in a second, is all of the indicators from this past season around specific players on the roster and wanting to be optimistic that they collectively can take that positive step forward. We'll get into that and some Doug Norrie thoughts in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, so much more. If we're looking ahead at the Eastern and Western Conference Finals, obviously you got some good games going here. I like Pacers plus 9.5. Celtics end up playing with their food a little bit too long with some of this stuff. Long layoff for them too. Not saying Pacers are going to win, but plus 9.5. I could see them keeping it close here against Boston. On the other side, let's go Mavericks plus 4. Old friend Kyrie Irving, Luka Doncic. After a long fought battle between the Timberwolves and the Nuggets, don't mind that plus 4. We're taking both road teams, both road dogs there, with the points over at FanDuel. You want to visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn. You're going to make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so as we continue the Locked On Nets episode, I'll start off here. Feel free to jump in with your thoughts if you wanted to specifically get something that we missed on there. But the other side of this, and I really think there is a reason to be optimistic for the Brooklyn Nets in the short term with the model they're working with, that, hey, some things can break your way, even if it feels like it never does for Brooklyn over the last handful of seasons. The downside would be, and the reason why I think Nets fans are so pessimistic, is because Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson have not turned out to be as advertised coming over in that trade. And it's really hard at their ages to look at them and say, oh, well, they'll get back to and really reset what we think about them. In a lot of ways, is it going to be Cam Thomas? Because if it's not Cam Thomas, then I think you actually have bigger problems. We talk about Noah Clowney. We're excited about some of the young guys, but those two veterans specifically, I think that's what fans are the most, hard pressed to believe in, that these guys can be a version of player on this currently constructed roster that can help you get to the playoffs, that can help you maybe push a team for a playoff series win in the first round.
Okay, so I'll counter that actually with a way something that I don't usually say when it comes
to the pendulum all episode long. I love it.
Yeah, no, and this is not a way that I usually take this, but I can counter this pretty easily, I think. The way to tell yourself the story around that is to say they were miscast. If they can either have, a guy like Cam Thomas step up, or let's say you trade for Donovan Mitchell, who takes the scoring load off these guys significantly. Yeah. And now all of a sudden they're back into the roles of which they're much better suited. We see time after time that these guys, and it happens all the time, is guys get miscast into certain roles. It gets a lot harder. And then the efficiency goes down. The expectations are too high. Like things kind of just get screwed up a little bit. And then when the pecking order gets reset, things just kind of end up start working back out again. I mean, there's examples. I mean, honestly, there's examples all over these playoffs, right? It's like, oh, Karl-Anthony Towns, not great as a number one. As a 1A or a 2 next to Ant, now it looks a lot better, right? Like Kyrie, right? We've seen many times with Kyrie. It's like Kyrie leading his own team or even next to Durant. I mean, that's going to be tough when it's like sort of just my turn, your turn. When it's him and Luka and he's just like, and you have to pay attention to, you can kind of let everyone else roam free. Now all of a sudden, all these other guys are just hitting threes like there's nobody's business, right? Aaron Gordon in Denver, miscast as the one in Orlando, becomes one of the best role players in the whole NBA. So I think that when it's next to Jokic, not to say that Nets have these other superstar guys, but if they are able to bring in like a Mitchell or someone else in that caliber of player, and now everyone gets pushed down a rung, back into the spot where we used to see them as good value, then your whole opinion changes. And I think that like from that standpoint, they kind of are one player away. Like one player away from resetting everyone else's organizational hierarchy or basketball on-court hierarchy. They really are. And now that one player is hard to get, Donovan, the stars are hard to get and you have to give up a lot to get it. But you can see how adding just like one guy can push everyone back into the roles where we used to like really cheerlead how good of a pickup they were. And maybe it's just that easy.
And the funny thing is too that I think you would agree, and I agree with you, right? I mean that's a part of the silver lining of how can this team be better, how can they turn it around and be more fun in the upcoming season. But I think the difference for you and me is saying if you get Donovan Mitchell, a lot of fans would say make the case that, and then all of a sudden you're Eastern Conference Finals competitive. I don't know if that's the case or not. Now Eastern Conference is obviously more open than the West. We understand that, but the difference of, to your point, just getting guys slotted correctly and just feeling like night over night, the system, the team, the players can all function properly. You and I have said this before on the podcast, watching these playoffs and reflecting on how possessions looked, not even games, just possessions looked for the Brooklyn Nets this past year. It made me feel like I was not watching the NBA covering the Brooklyn Nets this past season because it just did not have any of the system, any of the flow. And that comes down to talent. It comes down to guys being able to take players one-on-one off the dribble on the offensive end, like all the things that we know that the Brooklyn Nets have lacked. But it is such an insane contrast what you see from these playoff caliber teams. And you mentioned Haliburton for the Pacers. Those injuries slowed him down even throughout these playoffs. But then when you saw what looked like the closest thing to fully healthy version of him, you saw that burst. You saw that player that can get the ball in his hands and really make things happen. And it's what the Nets lack. Maybe Cam Thomas is that guy for them for sure. I like the idea, maybe just to tie a optimistic bow on it. We said this before. I don't know if Donovan Mitchell is the right move, the price point, all those things. You can talk me into it just for being a better team. We've talked about pivoting to other lower rung players. I'm starting to round into liking the idea of the Brooklyn Nets trying to get back into the draft to make a move, maybe moving on from a veteran, being in a position next year as the deadline approaches to look at the guys that are entering the final year of their contract, right? To take the risk. Can you re-sign them like the Pacers, like with Siakam, and say, hey, is the price point a little bit lower here for us that we can take a short-term sample and then maybe move ourselves forward that way. That seems like the lowest risk while still having reasonable reward expectations, being back in the playoffs and giving a team a run for their money.
Yeah, look, and we've long been on the train of, reset this thing. It's going to be hard to compete here for the next few years.
Yeah.
Reset this thing down to the studs. That's just kind of where they are. They put themselves in this spot. It's just what happens. They took a swing, it missed, and now you kind of rip it down based on who you have left. If they had, if they took a swing and they still had like SGA, I would not say that, right? Like this young, they still had took a swing to build. Honestly, actually, take it back. Like the Pacers, they took a swing, add Siakam. He's older. Let's say it didn't work at all. You wouldn't rip it back down because you still have Haliburton, right? Like you still have some of these, you still have younger players. Yeah. And that's kind of like don't have as much of that. So I just think that we've long stood in the platform of it just kind of doesn't make sense for what they've already done and where they are and what they have. And that's just the way it is. But if the goal is to be entertaining and the goal is to try to get lucky a little bit on sort of like what happens to other teams, I do think it's better for ticket sales and better for excitement and better for just like fan base to just have a team that plays in a playoff series and wins. I'm still for that for sure. I just think it probably has a shorter shelf life than some of this other stuff, but I'd still go for it. Like if they traded for Mitchell, like we said, I don't think it's a good idea, but in the end, would it make them better and be a more exciting team? Of course. Like it'd be insane to say otherwise. So I don't know. I'm a little torn, and will say the way the Eastern Conference shook out a little bit, I don't know. You could kind of see it being a little more tenuous as it goes forward too, as the age of some of these dudes.
Oh, of course. And yeah, it's all relative to what's the ultimate goal here for this team. I would note, and it's funny, I would note players like saying Chris Middleton in Milwaukee, very old, he'll be 34 next season. You look out across the landscape, Miles Turner and the Pacers, but obviously, I mean, talk about a guy that went from being like, hey, when can we dump this dude off this roster to, a part of a team going to the Eastern Conference Finals and keeping him around. And that's how fast narratives change too around the NBA. But I mentioned some of those players that will be on expiring deals next year going towards the deadline. And the hard part, maybe, Aaron Gordon's going to be Aaron Gordon's still not 30 years old yet. I don't know why that blows my mind. Some of these players will be available. I think the other hard part that we'll get into at a deeper level would be next year as the deadline approaches and you think about some of these players and you maybe want to make that move. I think all these teams will say, yeah, well, we're retooling on the fly as well. We'd love to have Mikal Bridges to be a supporting cast member for us. We'd love to have player X. And that's a part of the hard spot the Nets find themselves in, where they're committed or where they seem to be committed to certain players and still wanting to maybe bring in pieces that help make them better without giving up what they're calling their current core, right?
Right. And that's actually a problem too. Maybe this is for another episode, but it's not like the Nets are the only team in this position. There's lots of other teams that are out there right now being like, hey, we might be only one guy away from being really good. And now all of a sudden, like now you are competing with, it's not like only the Nets want these guys. Like you look over at Philly and you're like, well, we might be one guy from the championship because we might be a Donovan, not him. He's not probably a great example, but we might be like one guy like that away from a championship. The Lakers clearly probably want to keep winning, right? The Bucks want to keep doing this. Like they'll have a harder, the Heat, they have a harder time maybe putting the same packages together, but it's not like they're not going to try. It's like the Nets aren't the only team that might see them being one guy away from being awesome. The Magic even, right? There's teams out there that are going to see this the same way. And I think sometimes people get a little confused that it's like just the Nets want these guys. It's like, no, everybody does.
Join us next time when we lay out the landscape of all the teams that could be standing between Brooklyn and their pursuit of stars over the course of the next couple of years.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Much appreciate everyone rocking us. Don't rock us. Rock with us. We're through the playoffs.
Rock me, baby.
Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast.
The nightmare is you spend the rest of your life being funny at parties, and then people say, why didn't you do that when you were on television? That is Conan O'Brien.
Oh, one of the all-time great posts. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. Yeah.